Welcome to Cracking Legal Innovation, a podcast about the people working to modernise a centuries-old profession. In this episode, we're joined by Jeff Westcott, Director of Practice Technology, Innovation and AI at Akin. Prior to Akin, Jeff has held senior innovation leadership roles at several global firms. He has a bachelor's degree of science and computation from Manchester University and an MBA from Bayes Business School. Jeff will share his insights on what it takes to build an effective innovation team, the realities of securing budget in a traditional law firm environment, and the growing importance of blending legal and non-legal talent. We will also explore how firms can balance the external pressure to showcase innovation with the need to deliver meaningful operational impact. I'm also joined by my co-host, Legatic CEO Anthony Seal. Jeff, welcome.
I understand you've been at Akin for about 10 months now. Would that be?
Yeah, so I boomeranged back, as it's known to Akin. So I was here for 7 years, started in 2014 in a much broader kind of traditional tech sort of back office sort of IT role, much more screwdriver in the pocket type stuff. And then as I went through, slowly got more and more interested in the kind of process management side, and went off and did an MBA. Got delusions of grandeur about how to change an organization from within, and immediately decided to leave to test out that theory. So I spent a couple of years at Clifford Chance working with Anthony Vineron, real kind of star in the industry, and then a couple of years at BCLP as well, running their innovation team, which was huge fun, before getting enticed back to interesting challenge to sort of start an innovation team where once there was none.
So you're really coming in, and what's there at the moment?
So we've, I like to think of it as more like a brownfield. So, there's definitely been stuff happening. It's certainly on the practice technology side and, burgeoning AI areas of interest, but it's been very sporadic. And I think, certainly what I've noticed, we've got a small team. So there's 4 of us in total. We've got 2 in DC with a new joiner this week, and 1 in New York, and me over in London. And it's trying to really sort of bring together all the efforts that have happened, at the firm. There has been lots of success, but it's kind of been pretty understated and perhaps a bit lost in the noise.
And how does it feel coming in with that mandate? Because you're coming in, you're maybe bringing some of your own ideas, you're building something new. Is it scary, exciting?
Yeah, it was super exciting, because I think there's not many opportunities you get to kind of go in somewhere and put your own stamp and kind of leave all the failures and mistakes you've made behind somewhere else and pretend that you never made them. So it's but it's a great team. I know the firm really well, and I know kind of the atmosphere, and that was kind of one of the challenges, really, understanding that culture behind it, being pretty entrepreneurial, but in a sort of quite uncoordinated way. And I think my challenge really is to try and bring some order to that, so that we can kind of bring those efforts together, and also get credit for them internally, and build up a bit of a profile and build a better success rate, really.
It sounds like there's quite a few things there. Your first task is bringing some structure around it and coordination. Would that be right?
Yeah, I think a lot of technology roles, I think, in law firms are still bucketed in that, very much the order takers and the back office, the guys running around with, like I say, screwdrivers in their pockets, fixing things and alchemizing, bringing together stuff that couldn't be done. And I think it's really trying to change that perception, really, and move into more of a sort of value add and a more of a trusted advisor. And I know that's a kind of cliched term, but really to kind of have that kind of credibility that technology does actually deliver meaningful change, not just something for the enthusiasts over in the corner. So that's the sort of mandate, really, and it's a tricky one to deliver, really, because it's a pretty skeptical industry and a skeptical firm.
Yeah, it's amazing how much it seems to come back to that culture piece. I think what you describe as an entrepreneurial culture, I think that sounds like it gives you an excellent base, but I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that we're in a risk-averse industry, that things aren't necessarily seen to be broken, that people can be really resistant to change. law firms can be really hierarchical. Like it can be a challenging environment as well. Have you got thoughts on how to kind of make it hard?
It's hard to change and lawyers are risk averse and they won't do things. And I think just understanding how busy and how many other things are going on in a firm at one time, and you realize that what you think is the most interesting and exciting thing in the world is really just a blip for someone else. And I think it's really trying to make sure that we're aligning ourselves properly with the same incentives and the same structure at the firm. And that's a tricky thing to do, because then you've got to understand what those incentives and what that culture is really. It is a tough one. And I think it's a tough one. It's also easy to band together all legal under one roof and say it's a kind of homogenous set of tasks that sit within a field. And it's kind of almost saying that, I don't know, all music is the same. They've got all different genres, and then each one of those has got subgenres, and each of them have got different followers and different appreciation for different elements of it. And certainly not going to say who's the heavy metal fans at Akin, but there's just, you're trying to preach to a very diverse audience, and I think it's kind of difficult to say, you can treat them all as one.
Yeah, it's probably a bit of a simplistic view to just say there is one culture in the organization or one
100%.
type of person.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that goes to the, you've got to then pick your battles, because if you try and accommodate all of those mini cultures within the firm, then you end up with that really common phenomenon where you start lots of things and don't ever really finish anything. And I think that kind of, again, leads people to think that this is not an investment of time worth doing. That comes back to those incentives.
So, Jeff, maybe to dive into the people side of things, obviously you need to take into account coming into an organization which you know well from your prior time at Akin, but what structure to set up. And you've seen a number of different structures probably through your various roles and through conversations with others leading on innovation at other firms. So maybe to start with, like what different structures have you seen at different firms for an innovation function?
Yeah, and I think it's also, I suppose, again, in the network of peer firms as well, you hear all the different varieties. And I think broadly you can sort of put them into a few buckets really. So one is around the sort of products, and you're closely aligned to product management, and you have a team that's really about successful adoption of a product or a suite of products. And then you've got more of the internal advisor, so like looking for those processes and process re-engineering, understanding, and then drawing that out and then building something that adopts those requirements. And then you've got the sort of more hybrid team where it's probably a little bit more opportunistic, and you go where the demand is, and that demand can come from different places. It could come from a KM team, or it could come from the practices themselves, but it is sort of more project driven, I guess. And it's kind of seen all three of those work, and bits of them that are really strong in all of them. What we're doing at Akin, it's such a small team, we're trying to take elements of all of that really and blend that together. And I suppose crucially, one thing that we don't have is, armies of people, and certainly armies of people on the practice side. So we have to be pretty strategic about how we lure people into our area and make sure that we can kind of take some of their time. That could be people within the practices. It could be people outside that, and the technology group or project management, really to try and make sure that we've kind of assembled a crack team that doesn't know they're a crack team.
So you're sort of slightly stealing people who might think they're someone else. They might think they're a lawyer, but actually they're an innovation lead champion. Is that?
Yeah, and I think it's difficult when you give people labels and say, "So, oh, you are the innovation champion for your practice," and it kind of then feels like everyone else can just switch off. So I think you really want to try and make sure that it's that embedding really, and try and make sure that you can embed the right people in the right roles. And I think a lot of it is making sure that they don't necessarily understand that they're now part of the legal tech or practice tech or AI projects, but I think coming back to that question, that point about incentives, that they genuinely feel it's something that's worth them personally doing, but generally it's worth their practice taking notice of as well.
I suppose that's key, Jeff. You mentioned you're quite a lean team. by being able to identify those champions, they become an extension of your team to a degree within the particular practice areas?
Yeah, no, I think it's making sure that our team have, that the credibility within the teams that they're going into, and that hopefully rubs off a little bit along the way, and that people can see that this is now their project. And I think we like to sit somewhat in the background. I think you always want to kind of have, if we're driving the project from initiation and we're throwing it over the fence at the end, it will die on the vine for sure. So you've kind of got to take the long road and really sort of stand behind and facilitate and enable and inveigle your way into the right meetings, but largely make it seem like it's not my project or an innovation team project. It's your project, it's your practice and your successful project team that are going to get this done. So that's the key bit for me. So and to your point about the people that you need to sort of lead, that is people that can actually really communicate that vision well and are happy to take the back seat at times and let people take the credit, because that's a big part of making sure that the projects themselves have got credibility.
And in terms of structure, we've seen a few different ones that firms adopt in terms of practice area specific focus, in terms of within your innovation team itself. If you're building up the team, being focused, like having an innovation person focused on, say, real estate and litigation and the various other practice areas, versus having product owners for a particular product who becomes the expert in the product and then goes out to the different practice areas, or having a full team that's fully clued up on every single tool that's part of the toolkit and taking that approach. What's your view on the different models from that perspective?
Yeah, it's a bit of a dilemma, because in a perfect world, you would want to kind of be able to have that giant structure where you've got 30, 40 people that are covering every practice group and everyone's clued in the right things. But reality is that headcount is not something that firms want to grow in on the business services side or the support side. And it's really then got to kind of come from within. So it's really about trying to convert some people within the practice group, and our team, rather than sort of necessarily focusing on a practice group or a certain style, whether it's transactional or litigation or policy or regulatory. I think it's really making sure that we're kind of rising above that, going back to the sort of music analogy, is making sure that we're got a good broad spectrum of musical tastes across the team, and that can speak to people who enjoy that type of music. But we're not necessarily saying we only do this piece, because I think you then sort of limit yourself, and especially as a firm with so many diverse practices like Akin, where you've got so much bleed between groups. That's one of the strengths of the firm, is that we want the transactional teams talking to our policy teams and cross-selling and working together on various plans. So it doesn't really make sense to have designated, this is your bit of technology and this is yours. It's kind of much more trying to understand where the synergies are, and for our team to really probably stay as more kind of consultants in the middle, who can kind of adapt and understand all of the different groups, and or at least the bigger pockets of that, and try and make sure that we build the right connections between them.
On the topic of being a consultant to your sort of internal stakeholders, I know firms take a different approach where sometimes it's about having the solutions available, and then they're coming in and they're kind of awakening them and letting them know what's available and supporting them in that way, versus being more driven by the need and, consulting back to then figure out what the solutions are. Do you have a view on which way round works, or is it a combo?
Yeah, it's again, it's that trade-off, isn't it? You could spend an age trying to, focus on the problem and not the solution, and solutionism, trying to find a problem for that solution to fit into. You have enough experience within the team and within our sort of peer network to know what broadly works. What tools are going to fit into the firm because of the type of work we do. We do M&A work, so you need diligence platforms. You do litigation, so you need e-discovery. But you do need to kind of then have that understanding of to what degree do you need to understand the process? And I think you do have to have an understanding. I think if you can't just throw technology at no process and expect it to work, and you can't throw technology at a bad process and expect it to work. But you can bore the ocean and trying to really document process within a a busy legal team, and you'll end up getting nowhere. So you've kind of got to get that balance right. So you've got to have enough indication that there is enough process to be able to fit a technology into, and there's also enough appetite. And that probably comes back to that culture question, that there's enough appetite for that change within that team to incorporate that. So enough flex. But, I think it's like everyone would love to have formalized playbooks for every type of piece of legal workflow within each practice, but it just doesn't work like that at a firm like Akin, at least.
If you have to pick like appetite versus process or something like that, so you've got, I don't know, a team that's working on some highly processized piece, but they just, they maybe don't want your help so much, or they're not so receptive, or they think they've got it covered, but you're looking at the process and it's really standardized and you're thinking, a bit of technology here could really help. And another team that's maybe really loud and really wants to use technology, but maybe it's quite a niche use case or something like that.
So out of the two, I would definitely pick the appetite one, because I think that is what gets people to, change their ways. And I think it is habit forming. So if you get enough of it happening over a long enough period of time, it becomes, that's the way we get things done around here. And that's the key change that we want to see with that technology, because that means then the technology is embedded into, even if it's not a documented process, you've got a way of doing things.
Yeah, and one more person in your team who can then go and do.
Yeah, and I think that's our aim really, is with any piece of technology. It's finding the right fit so that it can sustain itself, without our constant tending and nurturing, because you have to do that at the start and make people aware of it and understand how to use it and get the buy-in and all of those things. But if you stop doing that and back off, and then adoption falls off a cliff, you kind of just know it's just not going to work. That's just not the firm. And either you then readjust and say, what, maybe it's just one team within a group that is going to use this, and that's what we're going to get from this. Whereas I think that pressure to try and expand out to the entire practice or the entire firm or whatever it is, you're setting yourself up for a pretty mammoth task.
Yeah, I think we've always found that mindset piece is almost the biggest piece. So we've had a couple of situations where we've replaced an existing platform, and I thought it was going to be really tough because people are going to be, I don't know, it's almost like you start to love a certain UI and there's certain buttons and things you get really used to. But actually the rollouts there have been fantastic in terms of adoption. And I think it's because the biggest piece is just mindset change. Like, do we believe in transaction management? Do we even know it exists? Do we want to work in a new way? Have we found the sort of people that want to do that? And the sort of technology piece, to me anyway, has seemed a bit secondary to how big mindset pieces.
And I think you need that sort of memory of pain. Like, what was it like before this thing came in? And I probably had to get over that hump of learning how to use it and make a couple of mistakes. But honestly, I don't want to be creating signature packets manually myself and sending 15 emails to get them done. I think it's more that when that clicks and you understand, then the technology is just the thing that you choose to solve that problem. You've kind of already done that plumbing work or that wiring behind the scenes to say there's a need for something to fit in here. And in some areas that's happened a long time ago. You wouldn't think of doing some things without technology now. It'd be crazy. But that's still quite, I think it's trying to convince people sometimes, or convince is the wrong word, but I think encourage people to understand that there is another way. And that's, again, the challenge of all of our innovation teams around the firm is kind of having that airtime to understand what could that look like, and and going back to the pain point, that's usually the best way to kind of help people get there is identify that is pretty painful what you're doing now.
So I'm interested, Jeff, when thinking of how then to actually get technology adopted internally, how do you think of the skill sets that are needed by the team that you're building? Maybe starting from, how important do you think domain expertise is? So someone who's either been a former lawyer previously, I know that's always a question that comes up, the degree to which being a former lawyer is important within an innovation role. And then maybe secondary to that, maybe just if someone's actually had exposure to a law firm environment, is that sufficient? So maybe, what are your views on that?
Yeah, I think exposure is certainly a good thing, because, they're funny old places and they generally have a way of working that is somewhat different to kind of other firms, even sort of professional services firms. So you do have to have that accommodation for the fact that things take certain, it takes a certain route, and there's no rhyme or reason for it. That's just the way politically you get things done. And I think law firms are a political entity at the end of the day, much rather than a balance sheet driven organization. And I think to the question of getting, do you need that domain expertise? I think that is it's a choice, really. I think you can bring in that domain expertise and that kind of shortcuts, definitely shortcuts at the short term, because you've got someone who can go and speak to those practitioners and tell them from experience how this will fit in and give that confidence and credibility. But then that kind of does leave you with kind of quite narrow domain expertise, and then a little bit of over-reliance sometimes on that one person to be then your kind of personal support or practice support person. And I think that fits if you've got that kind of model where that's what you want to build in and augment the practices with someone who can be that advisor. But I think, my opinion at least, I think what we've got, we've got, all the 3 people that work in the innovation team, apart from me, have got legal qualifications, legal education, not necessarily huge practicing experience, but can understand how things work and can speak to the, the pressures of being a lawyer. And it's much more about the kind of how they can translate and how they can kind of act as that advisor. Because from the lawyer's point of view, they're the ones that are in charge of that other domain, the sort of technology domain. So they need to give enough confidence that they know their onions there as well. So I think it's a balance, really. And I think some practices it works a lot better than others. I think especially if you've got something really highly technical and focused that's very process driven, real estate, property transactions or something, it's pretty well structured, and you really need to know how that works to be able to go in and speak to a group without wasting their time. But then to other areas, they're much more interested in, they know much less than we do about what the tech is available out there, and they need that kind of what's the art of the possible that isn't hampered by our lack of knowledge. And that's the groups where you really want to bring someone in from that group who's going to be that domain expertise and be able to say, yeah, this fits, this doesn't fit, this is how we work, this is how the tool works, and try and make them fit in the middle. And I think more and more it's going towards that latter way of working where the tech is less of a barrier. It's more about kind of making it fit and augment, and really integrate into that practice the better.
So you mentioned sort of the ability to communicate, the technology being something that's really important as part of a role for the people in your team beyond the domain expertise. What other skills do you look for people in your innovation team?
Yeah, I think the communication and the sort of salesmanship, I think is really, really key, because, you've got such limited time. I think people talk about elevator pitches, but, you've got an environment really where people aren't going to read your emails. People aren't going to come to your webinars. People aren't going to, probably stop when you stop them in the elevator. So you've really got to find your way of getting around that. And I think it's kind of more of a political communication, really. You've got to have something that resonates and be able to kind of give that soundbite, that is going to match what that person is you're talking to is going to spark something in them. And that's what you've really got to have. And I think that's less about how technical you are and how able you are to, implement and deliver. It's much more about selling the vision, the story about why we're doing these things and what this means to you. So I think you need that level of empathy that goes along with that communication. And I think you need that understanding, again, of that political environment about that's all very well, but who should you really be speaking to in this group that's going to make things happen, and who's the detractor who I need to get in front of as well. And I think you do need a certain level of bravery to kind of stand up in front of both of those people.
How do you, because I've noticed with some firms, there are wonderful people in the innovation roles who can do a lot of those things, but sometimes it does come down to just how much political capital they do have to actually, get the change happening. So, you could probably interview, as part of building your team, people's ability to, tell a good story, to do all of this. Ultimately, it probably comes back to that cultural piece to a degree, but then also maybe thinking about what quick wins could we get to then build up that person's personal capital internally. This is someone who is delivering something that's of value. How do you think about that even if you've got the right people on the team, how you can make sure that they're empowered to actually implement the change that you need them to implement.
No, and I think you bang right by it. I think credibility is really key. And I think we, have traditionally, on the technology side or the business services side, or, fee earner, fee burner kind of, divide, have never done a great job of selling what we actually do well, and actually taking some credit for what these things are. It is really hard to measure success when you're, I've implemented a product and it's done X and this many people are using it, and therefore, what is the result been? And I think it's always been easy to say, well, it's difficult to say and it's mixed, and this group use it but this don't, so I don't know what our story is. And I think being a bit more front foot and a bit more savvy about kind of, you've got to do the selling of your own capabilities and your own efforts in order to kind of help the team sell the next thing. So I think embedding that with each of the teams. So making sure, and I think that is looking backwards at, a little bit upstream and saying, well, what are the things that then indicate that success? And whether that's, being featured in the firm newsletter or the intranet, or, being associated with good things, standing next to the right people, being mentioned in the firm town hall by the chairs of the firm, those kind of things kind of matter. And I think if you can make sure you get enough capital from that, then it makes a lot of the other things a bit easier.
So do you feel like you've got a vision that you're really selling to the firm?
Yeah, I think it's overall, yes. I think we're trying to, like I say, trying to break it down into very small chunks, but we're here to make your life easier. That's really all you need to know. I think I could explain at great length to a busy managing partner or a chair or whatever, but really they want, what are you here to do and are you doing it? And I think that's really key to kind of have some examples to point at, and also point at some people that they would know that they could speak to and get that reference point to say, yeah, that is happening. So I think more than that, the vision is fluid and changes, just like if you asked a law firm, what's your 5-year plan? I think you'd have some vagaries about growing revenue and demand and whatever else. But ultimately, it's really about being adaptable and opportunistic and being able to kind of navigate a path forward that's going somewhere, rather than kind of go around. It's very easy to go around in circles.
Yeah. As a good salesman, I quite like it. I've seen one or two innovation people, even like junior innovation people, who have kind of really like stood up to partners a bit. And I don't know, maybe I just want the story or something like that, but I really like it when you sort of see a little bit more like bravery and like, my theory is like, I don't employ people to tell me why I'm right. I employ them to tell me why I'm wrong and what we could do better. And people who can really embrace that and push a little bit, push back when partners aren't engaging or, don't quite think about profitability right in their business. Do you ever...
I think they definitely exist, and it is hard, and it feels like you're doing something wrong by saying, no, that's a bad idea. And I think you have to frame it in the right way, and you have to kind of protect egos and understand, status and, again, the politics behind things. But I would always, want someone on the team to be able to stand up and say, no, we're not doing that, but I don't think you'd ever just say, no, we've brushed you off. I think we've said, we've looked at that and this is why we're not doing this. Also, one of the key things that I sort of, a firm tenant I have within the group is that, we have limited capacity. The firm has limited capacity for change. So we have to have a list of, our 4 or 5 things that we're doing. And if someone comes in from the side and says, we now need to do this, is really looking at that list and saying, well, which of these don't you want us to do then? And that then becomes an easier question, because I think if you're in a world where everything is free and everything is possible, sure, we can take a demo of that and we can have a pilot, but pilots become, something that's hard to take away from. So you do have to hold the line. And I think having a bit of backbone, and I do think the partners that are influential at law firms do like to hear no. And I think, there's a pretty foul-mouthed term from one of our New York partners, but he really hates having someone that is saying no to him, but is really saying yes, and that's something I think we need to encourage a bit more of. And from that status point of view, that does take you away from being that kind of order taker and yes man, whatever, into someone who's actually taking a sensible advisory approach and giving you some consultation there.
I remember, like, as a lawyer, there were people who would just say yes to all work. They wanted to be as helpful as possible. They might even like burn themselves out by saying yes to you. And then there are people who would sort of say no to work, and that's a really scary thing to do, particularly as a junior lawyer or where you want to develop a reputation as within the firm. But I always felt like ultimately the people who said no to work were actually more respected by the partnership than the people who said yes, either because they said yes and then couldn't deliver, or maybe there's just something about saying no, which is that you're having a proper conversation and actually like setting some boundaries in that conversation, and that actually generates respect in itself.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes it's not even just about a no, it's about it's that follow-up question. I think that's what I hear all the time from lawyers. That impetus is like the client's asked me to do something and it's a Thursday and I've now got everyone enabled, but the client doesn't even need it till Wednesday. So, is there a need to do it tomorrow, or could it be done on Monday? Do I need to work the weekend to do this? I think that push back and saying, look, what's the priority of this, and do we need to do that, kind of echoes through the firm as well. Just because someone says we need to do something doesn't mean we can never do it. It just means that we'll put it in the pipeline, and we might see you in 6 months, when we've done these other things. But I think understanding that, because otherwise you end up in a sort of plate spinning nightmare where you've started, again, hundreds of projects, and people have got expectations that I've seen that demo, so I'm assuming you'll be putting it in my hands pretty soon because I liked it. And that, you kind of got to do a bit of gatekeeping and expectation management to make sure that, the firm writ large understands that you're doing the right things and they're all positive things, but we have limited capacity to enable those things. Even if we had more headcount, it doesn't mean that we're just going to do more things. It just doesn't work like that.
On the topic of saying no, because I think that's a really interesting one, the analogy with having been a lawyer, and I've just been reflecting back on what it was like for me as well, because I think I saw two types of people: those who said no and burnt their political capital internally and just didn't get work, and then those who were able to say no but articulate the reason for the no well. And again, I think just so much of it comes down again to being able to navigate the internal environment and culture of the particular law firm that you're in. But yeah, I do agree that some of those people who I now know are actually, senior partners at some really big firms were some of the ones who were much better at saying no than others, frankly, including myself. Like, I kind of felt the way to navigate early on as a junior lawyer was, I was kind of taught by the person that was my most immediate senior, never say no to work, because that's the way you build up your political capital. You take on the work, you already know you're going to be there till 1 a.m, and someone comes asking for something else, you just say yes. If someone asks you if you've got capacity and all of that. Whereas actually knowing when you can push back and say, look, the work I've got at the moment is going to take me till 1 a.m. If this is really urgent, really important, there's no one else available, let's have a chat. But, could you go and speak to someone else? It's basically a no, but navigated in the right kind of way.
It is, and I think it also does need you to understand like how law firms work and how things come in, and that sometimes it is just going to be an urgent thing, and we've all just got to roll our sleeves up and just get it done because a client's asked us to do something. Maybe they could have given us more notice, but we're not going to go back to the client and say, hey, well, just because you're disorganized, we're not going to get your whatever it is done. I think there's times to come together, but what you don't want to do is for that to be the norm. I think everyone doesn't mind flexing and showing that you can have that capacity. But again, that's a reason to keep, your portfolio of things that you are doing relatively manageable so that you have got that ability to flex. And I'd be totally lying if I was saying, if you're the most senior rainmaker in the firm and you want something badly, that I'm going to turn up and say, well, here's the 3 reasons why we're not going to, do that. Sure, but how are you going to get it done? That those things happen. I think it's just making sure that if you are going to do those things, you've got some understanding of how that can fit in, so that you're not just that's not going to be the same thing for anyone else that comes in and does things. And that's just reflecting that it's a different. All partnerships are not made equal.
Yeah. How do you navigate that conversation though? So a senior rainmaking partner comes to you, urgently needs this particular tool, and you mentioned you've got your size team, your particular budget. Doing this new project is going to mean something else is either stalled or put off altogether. Things are in train. your team are already maybe for a launch, or you've been managing expectations with one of your potential suppliers that they're going to be coming in the next quarter. Like, what does that actually look like internally, and how do you both communicate it to the that particular partner, maybe the others who are waiting for this other project and we're ready for that to get onboarded, and then maybe the vendor as well? I'm interested in sort of how you think of working through all of that.
Yeah, I think it's setting yourself up to have that, that flexibility means, I suppose, risk. It comes down to risk management. How quickly you can get something done typically comes down to like, well, what's the impact this going to have? Like, is this someone wants, a tool, and to be honest, we can say that it's completely compliant. It fits in with all our other systems. It can slot in. It's not going to cost us too much money. That's an easier sell than saying, hey, senior partner coming in saying, I want a new document management system because I don't like the one that we've got. That's so it comes down to a question of feasibility, I suppose, and viability. And I think, again, that expectation management, and can we break this into chunks? So can we, let's do a bit more exploratory work. Let's, get you or your team set up with some demo accounts, and being very clear that we need to kind of have something to take back to the project board or the whoever's going to sign off the checks to make sure that this is going to fly, and it's not going to blow a hole in the side of our security thing. I think that's the one time that you can go back and say, this is a firm no. I want to use my iPad and use it for client work, and I don't want to use your firm systems. Like, the answer is just going to be no, and that's a hard no. Whether a lawyer chooses to do whatever they want, I can't stop that, but I can't facilitate that. So I think it is difficult. And then the knock-on effects are really about, as you say, about existing projects. How do you kind of tie that together and say, look, we need to kind of have that flexibility in, investigating this small piece. And I think it's trying to keep it manageable and small so that we have a small diversion rather than a complete pause and a project hold. I think the types of project we do, I think we've always got that flex to accommodate the weird and wacky ideas. And some of them turn out to be great ideas as well. It's worth understanding how that demand can be turned into something that's, a force for good from our point of view, and maybe it pushes something else in that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
It's great to at least have the enthusiasm for that. I still wonder though, is at a whole, is that the right way to be operating, to be having sort of random requests, or for the innovation team to be driven by the practice areas? With so much technology coming in, with it becoming so important to practice, is there an argument to say, okay, well, this exists really at the top firm strategy level. This is like a COO conversation. This is a CFO managing partner. How do we want to do this across the firm? And actually, we're going to have this driven by a central strategy. And yes, that's fantastic that we've got enthusiastic people coming along at various stages and saying yeah, I want to do this. And then we'll enable some of the projects. Maybe we'll have to say no to some of them. But is this really central strategy?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think it's true. You do have to kind of, the biggest part of strategy is choosing what you don't do, right? And it's making sure that on that list, you've really got some kind of cornerstones that, at the end of the year, you can kind of hold your hand and say, look, these are the things that we said that we're going to do, and we've done them. And I think those have got to be kind of unwavering. And those are the things that are, strategic. We've got the ability to kind of point to them and say, look, well, this is what adoption means. This is why we've driven adoption in this. This is what benefit it brings. And that's the bit that we're going to get that, goes on our end of term report. But, we just have to accommodate. I think where it's easier to accommodate some of these other point solutions, they typically tend to be the smaller things. So for a specific practice group, their needs are not fulfilled by the other tools that we've brought, and maybe a little bit left out. I think you've got to have that capacity to engage and harness some of that interest. And I think largely what we're seeing from the vendor side as well is that, it's much easier to bring tools in. We're not having to connecting the plumbing up, in such a way that we used to, where the lead time would be like, it's going to take us 3 months to get something in. These are all SaaS products. Generally, I think vendors have now figured out that actually, even within big law firms, enterprise licensing is not everything. And there's just going to be a subset of group. And maybe it's just, we only have 20 tax lawyers, and we're going to pay for a tool that's for 20 people, not for 900. So I do think there's more of a sort of accommodation for smaller point solutions rather than us trying to hold the line and say, no, you must either use this tool that is a square peg in a round hole or you have nothing. I don't think we like to say that.
So, Jeff, maybe bringing in these different solutions, whether it's the ones that are planned or some that do come in, how do you think about, there's obviously budget set for the technology itself, and then separately you need to think about the people that are going to support that. And do you think about that as a collective budget? And do you also think about, when implementing a tool, how the heads sort of factor in to the implementation as well?
Yeah, to me, it comes down to a lot of sort of cost of ownership. What's the ongoing cost that's, once we've got through that first year of the getting the budget in and deploying, you've got the initial excitement, everyone's, you're doing training, you're doing all that stuff. I think it's, what happens after that and that transition to that sustainable, growth that it is really key. And again, that's why you need to bring in, people from those other groups. Like we work a lot with our technology training team and our kind of local IT support people. Really, they're the ones who are going to be the boots on the ground that are going to be coming into contact with that new lawyer that's come in, from another firm that says, yeah, I'm doing this, work, I'm having a mare with it, what can I use? And for them to be able to say, okay, well, here's what you need to use, or for us to be able to signpost adequately, because that is the hidden cost. If we as a team are still adding people to groups or enabling things or doing onboarding training, it would just suck up so much time, and it means you're not able to kind of offboard that. And I think through a lot of my career I was on the other side of the fence, where it's much more on the IT support and training and service delivery side, and I think that's given me that understanding of like, what do you need to do to hand that over to a group that are going to take it on? What are the knowledge base articles, what the vendor contacts, what's the roles and responsibilities around this. And from our point of view, we want to get involved at a product manager role and look at the roadmap and what's changing with this, from a more strategic level, and have the operational and kind of tactical bits handled by the teams that we've already got that handle the same thing for all of our other tools. And that's a tough thing to do, but it's more admin, but it means that we just don't get that lumbered with the operational ongoing support, and also that call at 3 a.m. on a Sunday when that poor busy lawyer is trying to get whatever it is they're done, and the help desk says, I've got no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'd be curious. I've got a bit of a product question, which is, so we spend a lot of our time trying to make the platform self-serve for lawyers. We try and make it so they can get started easily without, help, or the buttons make sense to them. And we document the whole platform in the knowledge base and provide walkthroughs and things. And then we see some firms sort of either gatekeeping a little bit or feeling like they've got a role, or the central innovation team should be kind of doing some implementation on every project, or they'll start taking the knowledge base articles or writing loads of kind of almost rewriting them and putting on top, or putting their own, sometimes some really important spin, but sometimes just sort of, you're like, sitting there and you're going like, why are you rewriting all the help content? Because we're the ones that can update that if that changes and things like that. Do you feel there's sort of really useful places to be involved, and where should we, in an ideal world, stop doing that kind of thing and innovation start?
Yeah, and I think that comes to whether you're onboarding a vendor or a partner, and I think that's really key. Because in my work, I think we should be having a broad, in a firm like us where we've got such a broad spectrum of practices and different tasks done by different people internationally, all the rest of it. We can't not have a portfolio of tools that the UK litigators are using, but the US litigators aren't. We're not just going to pick one of them and fill their needs. And I think to do that adequately with a small team internally, like, you do have to rely on that vendor to take the load, whether that's training, enablement, support, all of those things. I think you've got to kind of, it's a historic thing, and it's again a bit of a cultural thing, that we must gatekeep and we must put our firm logo, and this is the way that we do our, tip sheets or whatever. But it kind of harks back to an age when you would, have a big bang onboarding. You'd put a poster up in the toilets, you'd leave a note sheet on someone's seat so that they can see it when they come in the morning. So that just world has gone. I think, like you said, I think the focus has to be on great UI. I don't think we see the same problems with reliability and support that we used to with old systems, where something would just break and then suddenly it would go down. That it is a lot better, touch wood. But equally, like that extension of the support people, we should be relying on the people that know that product best. That we should be almost the pre-sales team and being able to go out and sell the team internally why have we bought it. But if it comes down to how does it work and which buttons do I press in which order, that's not something we want to really kind of retain and manage. That's not our business. We don't do that with Microsoft. So why would we do it for an even smaller organization?
Yeah, I remember when software came with like the literal book. I think I remember it was the first time I bought some kind of Apple product. There was just no bit of paper, and I was really confused by it.
And I think that is the way that and it probably speaks to a lot of the sort of Gen AI stuff at the moment. Is you've got to have that. We're still in that world where it's like the complicated Android phone, whereas people really want the Apple iPhone. I want a button that I can press and it does the thing, and that's it. If it doesn't work, I uninstall the app and I reinstall it.
But it's also just not practical given the rate of change now. I mean, it's one thing when you used to have your annual update of, it's the latest Microsoft, and then it makes sense to have a user guide and you look through it and you figure out what's changed. But, the pace at which SaaS companies are shipping new product, you'd endlessly be updating physical, your physical user guides if you were doing it yourselves now.
Yeah, and it's a big part of what our team, the innovation team here at Akin, really need to focus on is one is really working with those vendors and making sure we know what's coming down the line, because being involved as a gatekeeper and saying, well, we're not going to release your feature until we're ready for it. Most of the time there's no on-off switch, just it's there. And again, that's Microsoft downwards, so we just have to expect that, but we have to be ahead of the curve and ideally a little bit informed of what's coming. But then the second part is really about having that understanding that change is perpetual, and that preparing people to the UI to change. And I think we see that already though, and I don't think people are as resistant to that as we might think. Certainly on the lawyer side, as long as it still does the thing it's meant to do and you haven't just removed some functionality. Now, I remember I worked at a private equity firm, which obviously a lot of analysts in huge, spreadsheets and in models and all that stuff. And I was there when we transitioned from Word 2003 to Word 2007, which I think was in about 2009 or something, but it was whatever. And like the shortcuts stopped working, they changed all the shortcuts. And those people that have been on those boot camps at like Merrill Lynch and whoever else, and they spent a week learning to type all of the shortcuts to do a circular reference or whatever else, were just, why have you done this to me? And, it's absolutely nothing I could do about it, but it just shows you kind of, you've got some people that are really used to using some of these features, and taking things away is really hard, but continually being additive is even harder.
I'm interested as well, Jeff, maybe back on the selling point. You were talking about your team needing to constantly sell. There's obviously a role for you as well, continually selling internally about, the role of innovation within the firm.
Uh-huh.
How do you think about that as your role and the balance between implementing things of real value? How much do you want like some quick wins on the board to show your value and the value of your team versus things that are going to, make long lasting impact?
Yeah, I think we've always, it's something always on our mind. And as we see the list of demand, as the more successful we are and the more things that we deliver, those low hanging fruit, the more demand that comes in. And we then need to be better at handling that demand, because otherwise we become a place where ideas go to die, which is, not the intended effect. And I think there is, my role is, I suppose a lot of it is that expectation management. And, a lot of the time, even though I'm, the team is selling out, the stuff that we've decided to invest in and doing a great job on that. Some of my job is kind of pulling back on what are we going to do next then, making sure that we've got a balanced portfolio and it's manageable, because, we can't do everything. If you see they did a sort of sheet of all of the different new vendors, the new Gen AI vendors in various practice areas, it fits like a huge poster sized thing. And you think, well, we can't demo all of these. We can't speak to all of these. Like, which ones do we do and which ones do we not do? So it's really a lot about that kind of expectation management and saying, look, we've got this, where are we going to put our innovation dollars effectively, and which horses are we going to back? And, that understanding that some of those horses may, wither and die, and some of them might get eaten by bigger horses. And we've got to try and, it becomes much more of a navigating your way through a path. And, if you look like old, seafaring maps or something, you think, well, why have they gone that route round? But obviously there's the currents and the landscape and probably sea ice or whatever. Whereas before it used to be much more of a kind of very much incremental kind of, well, we'll start with this and then we'll expand out and then we'll do the next things in a sort of orderly fashion. So it does become that kind of trying to make sure that we're navigating through a kind of tricky environment with stuff popping up all over the place.
You mentioned the primary focus being making the lives easier of the attorneys. From a metrics or KPI perspective, thinking of how you justify spend on technology, on the people that you're bringing in, are there particular KPIs or metrics that you think about from an ROI perspective?
Yeah, there are, and I think I used to be of the view firmly that we need to have an ROI, and we need to calculate it and do a time and motion study, and every time you press the big button, this is what we get. We spent $300 on this, and we get $700. But just law firm economics just don't do that, and it's not the way that you could spend all of your time trying to prove out something. Certainly a firm like us where it is not commoditized, the work is completely nuanced. It's at the whim of timings of clients and markets and other uncontrollable events. So it's to try and pretend that you've got a linear equation that you can kind of apply to a piece of technologies, it falls down really quickly, when coming into contact with the people that need to open their wallets. So I think a lot of it, in terms of KPIs, adoption and storytelling is really around the best that we can get. I think it's, if we've got a tool that we've got a good story about why we brought it in, we've got understanding of the general value proposition, that every time we use it, this happens. And we've got an understanding of how that fits into the team. And then we've also got some people in those teams that are willing to stand behind it. And ideally at that point, they're selling it themselves, partner level down. That's kind of what we'd need that package to look like. So I think, it's less about pointing at a huge, dashboard of graphs and, lines that don't go anywhere, because you can make anything show that. And I think it's really about kind of what people feel, and that's really hard to measure and almost impossible. It's a bit of a cop out. It's focusing a little bit more on the qualitative. My wife's a professor at UCL in behavioral psychology, so kind of she does a lot of healthcare work with doctors and getting them to change their behaviors and prescribe less antibiotics or use less blood bags when they're doing a transplant or whatever. I've learned a lot actually from some of the stuff that she's done, in terms of like, it isn't a bad thing to have qualitative feedback, and you can synthesize that quite well into, meaningful decision making kind of, collateral, but it takes more time. You have to work harder at it. You have to go and collect, you have to speak to people, you have to, you can't just look at the adoption stats and say, well, these people press these 3 buttons, so that must mean this. You've got to go and get in front of those people, and whether that's focus groups or interviews or whatever else, and then it's trying to be consistent about how you do that, how you do that approach. So I do set a lot of store on constructing good quality interviews and good quality surveys, and try and make sure that we get quality rather than quantity. So rather than just dashing up something, hey, have you used it? Do you like it? Could you estimate how much time this saved you last month? Because those, they're just not good figures. You can't really stand behind them. So you may as well just try and, attack on the things that you can stand behind and focus on collecting a little bit less data, but better quality.
To ask you one final question to wrap up today's podcast, but maybe just to summarize, I think what I've really taken away are the challenges, but also opportunities coming in and sort of building out an innovation function, how much culture plays a role, the people and the talent that you have, but also, how you can use your internal champions as an extension of your innovation team the role that truly partnering with some of your vendors can play, the opportunity to say no at times in a positive way to both steady the path of what you're doing from an innovation perspective, and gain credibility. And then the role of like how you actually continually justify and sell what you're doing and the value of innovation within the firm. Maybe as a final question to round things off, if some firms are at different stages of their innovation journeys, and some have had established innovation functions for some time. Some, like yourselves, are really coming in and starting to think about building one or in the course of building one out. If someone was coming in and actually starting out an innovation function, what would be the key tips that you would give them to get the necessary buy-in and to get going effectively?
Yes, great question. I wish someone could give me the answers and on a little sheet. And I think it's one of those things. You read all the books, and I think you can have that best practice, and I think you can understand the role that culture plays, and archetypes and all the rest of it. But I think largely every firm, even though I've kind of said that law firms are the same, they all work the same, but every firm is different. I think you've got to learn how to play the hand you're dealt, and I think look through that deck and not just go off the obvious things. I think it's about understanding and listening a bit more probably to the areas where you're not hearing as much from. And I think it's a tendency always to go after if you've got the bell curve of people that are not interested and the people that are super interested, you've got those kind of few percentage people of noisy, interested people. And that's generally where we track over, because these people that are interested. But it's looking at that bell curve, the majority of the people are right here, and like, what are they doing? Like, what are the tools that is a standard piece of kit at other firms that are doing this kind of work for general drafting, or transaction management or litigation process. One of the best successes I think we had at BCLP was like a bundling tool that they didn't even know existed. When you speak to them and say how painful is bundling trial and for all these different parties, and how painful it is when a late insert comes in, and it's not a particularly sexy piece of technology. It's not something that you'd want to do a big launch like Steve Jobs out on stage and say we've revolutionized this. But it's those are the sort of things that it's not necessarily quick wins, but meaningful wins that I think you can get a lot of those hearts and minds to say, oh, you know what, this group took away something that we hated and replaced it with something that's average. It doesn't have to be that they love it. They love the fact they don't hate it, but I think it's not that painful anymore. That pain is real.
Fantastic. Watch this space, because I think bundling is unsolved still. And I think there's some big wins to be had on the things that people really, really hate. So yeah, thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks a lot.